people's psyches have been poisoned. They've been fed a kind of KFC for the soul. They've been taught that life is about things. They've been taught to seek happiness in places that can never deliver them happiness. And they've been taught to neglect or even to despise the things that would in fact bring them happiness, satisfaction, and meaning. But the good thing for us, and this might sound like an odd thing to say, and I don't want to sound like I'm trivializing the pain, which I have felt and is a dreadful, agonizing pain. The fact that the crisis is so bad, that so many people are depressed, that so many people are addicted, is in one sense positive, because it shows it's very hard to ignore the alarm when it's sounding from every building and every vehicle.
Hi, everybody. Marianne Williamson here. Thank you for joining me. We have something very important to talk about today, and that's the subject of spirituality and depression. In 2016, I published a book called Tears to Triumph about the relationship of spirituality to depression, the spiritual journey from suffering to enlightenment. And it's based on some experiences that I had over the last 37 years of my career. You know, for decades, I've been very up close and personal, working with people in really some of the darkest times of their lives, whether it had to do with someone who had been diagnosed with a life-challenging illness, or whether it was someone who was going through the loss of a loved one, or whether it was someone in recovery, or whether it was someone going through a divorce or a bankruptcy. The issue of despair, the issue of human sadness, the issue of going through very, very difficult times, what is we might call the dark night of the soul, is something that I have had a lot of professional as well as personal experience of. And I have a lot of thoughts about it, and I have seen the difference that being a student of the Course in Miracles has made, the difference that meditation has made, the difference that an entire context of a spiritual perspective has made, not only on my life, but on the lives of so many people that I have worked with. Several years ago, something began to happen that kind of shocked me. And that had to do with what seemed to be an almost overnight prevalence of antidepressant use, a pharmaceuticological interpretation of what depression and anxiety means that just became something we were all supposed to just accept. Now, I certainly believe that painkillers should exist. I certainly believe that OxyContin, I had surgery last year, and I was very grateful for OxyContin. I understand the need for painkillers. But we also know that predatory pharmaceutical executives perpetrated a terrible, terrible scam. And because of it, and this greatly contributed to the 450,000 people who died of painkiller overdoses. This, of course, is the opioid crisis. And Purdue Pharmacy has had to pay over $8 billion because attorneys general all over the country have indicted these pharmaceutical executives who did this. I think something very similar has occurred with antidepressants. Is there a legitimate use of psychotherapeutic drugs? Certainly in many cases. Obviously, it's very, very helpful. But what has happened over the last few decades, this idea that if somebody is crying for too long a period of time, going through all kinds of sadness, that this is by definition something that represents a chemical imbalance, something represents the term they use often as clinical depression, I believe has as much to do with a $100 billion pharmaceutical industry as it has to do with the deeper, most legitimate conversation around depression and anxiety. First of all, it should be noted that there is a black box warning on antidepressants, which says that for people under 25 years old, there is an increased risk. There can be an increased risk of suicidal ideation. And while many people go on and on about how important it is to be on these drugs so that people don't commit suicide, the truth of the matter is that the suicide rate has not gone down since antidepressants have become so popular in our society. Speaking of young people, I think it's important to note something I feel strongly as an older person, is that the 20s are hard. The 20s are hard. And if somebody has had their first heartbreak at 22 years old or 24 years old, this doesn't mean that something is wrong with them. That's the point here. We have taken this cheap yellow smiley face and just thrown it over everything. And we act like happy, happy, happy is always the best thing. Happy, happy, happy is not always the best thing because it's not always the authentic emotion. There are storms in nature and there are storms in life. And just as the body has an immune system, so does the psyche. The body can take an amazing amount of assault and injury and heal from it. And so can the psyche. The psyche can take a lot of heartbreak. And real healing works with the immune system, both physically and psychically. You can't just dull the pain. Just dulling the pain and acting like the treatment, that's what the pharmacological interpretation of depression and anxiety does. It points to brain chemistry, and it says brain chemistry is the root of the problem. Brain chemistry is a symptom of the problem. Brain chemistry is not the root of the problem. For that matter, a lot of what people are calling clinical depression today is not based on any kind of a scientific test of your brain chemistry. It's based on a clinical questionnaire. And for that matter, even in terms of brain chemistry, the food you eat affects your brain chemistry. Meditation affects your brain chemistry. So what I found was that people were on antidepressants. I understand. I've certainly worked with people who are schizophrenic. I've worked with people who are bipolar. I certainly understand the very positive uses of psychotherapeutic drugs in certain cases. And also, that's not my lane. When you're talking about someone who is schizophrenic or bipolar, that's certainly not my lane. But human suffering is my lane. Human suffering is not a scientific lane. Spiritual suffering has to do with the purview of the soul. And it's a very, very big deal because human suffering is part of life. And not all periods of sadness mean something's wrong. Sometimes a period of sadness is exactly what you need to go through. There's a message there. There is a lesson there. There is grief there. There is trauma there. There are situations there that we need to look at. Situations that we need to heal from. That's what my book, Tears to Triumph, is about. And there's another book, which is very much a complement to mine, something that is very similar in the message that is giving. And that is a book that came out a couple of years ago by Johann Hari that is called Lost Connections, Why You're Depressed and How to Find Hope. I'm so eager to have a chance to talk to Johann Hari on the podcast today because I feel that he too is giving a very, very important message, not only about finding hope in the midst of depression, finding hope in the midst of our anxiety, but also getting deep down into the root causes of depression and anxiety so that we can actually deal with what needs to be dealt with, both inside ourselves and in our society, so that we can find happiness and we can find peace. After my conversation with Johann, I hope that you'll hang around for Ask Marianne when I can answer a question or two. And let's do this. Let's talk to a very wise man, Johann Hari. He is a British writer born in Scotland. He is a journalist who has written for the New York Times, the LA Times, the Guardian, the Spectator, Le Monde Diplomatique, the Melbourne Age, and Politico. His TED Talks have been viewed more than 75 million times. He also wrote a book called Chasing the Scream, and I'm really eager and very honored to have him on with me today. Here he is, Johann Hari. Johann Hari, thank you so much for being on the podcast with me. I'm just honored that you're here.
Oh, Marianne, I'm so happy to be with you. Hooray.
Thank you. Thank you. You and I have a very common message, very similar material related to this topic. We both repudiate the dominance of the psychopharmacological interpretation of depression and anxiety. Your book, Lost Connections, is just beautiful. And you say there we have been systematically misinformed about what depression and anxiety are. You tell a story at the beginning of your book about eating an apple in Vietnam that had been poisoned by pesticides. You talk about what happened with nausea And then you use that nausea as a kind of metaphor for what we need to bring up in order to survive. Can you tell us the story? Because this, of course, is your own journey regarding the pharmaceutical treatment of your depression and anxiety to the other side of that.
Yeah, I apologize in advance because to some of your listeners, because the story takes a disgusting turn, but it's the only way I can explain it. So I was in Vietnam and I was doing some research for a book I was working on. I was interviewing survivors of the war with the United States. And one day I was staying in a place called the Very Charming Hotel in Hanoi. And I walked back to my room. I was walking back to the hotel and I saw by the side of the road people selling fruit. And so I bought an apple and I took it back to the hotel room. And I knew I like good traveler's advice. I've been to lots of places. You have to wash it in bottled water first. So I washed it and I bit into it and it tasted absolutely disgusting. But I was so hungry and so lazy and so tired, I just ate it, or about half of it, and then I tossed it in the garbage. And you can see where this story is going. The next day I woke up and I was just like violently sick. So I just, I lived on junk food for many years. I know how food poisoning works. I just lay there and just kind of threw up for like a whole day. And then it got to the next day and I remember I just spent the whole time watching CNN. So even now, I associate Anderson Cooper's face with throwing up, which I think is really unfair to Anderson Cooper. So I'm eating, I'm being sick, not eating anything, and this goes on for 3 days. And at the end of the third day, I thought, God, well, I don't have that much time left in the country. I've got to get on with my work. So I phoned my fixer and translator, the guy who was arranging my interviews, helping me meet people. Huang was his name, and I said, let's just go and carry on interviewing survivors of the war. So we drove 5 hours out of the city and we went to this place. And one of the people he found for me was an extremely old woman. I think she was in her 90s. And she was the only woman in her village who had survived the war, along with her children. And she had this amazing story. And I remember sitting on her little wooden hut. And she's telling me this story. And as she was speaking, I remember having this feeling like the whole room was kind of spinning around me, like really physically spinning. And just suddenly I just exploded in her heart, like from both ends. And I'm just like throwing up and everything. It was just, I'm sorry, I did tell you this story got disgusting. And I'm sort of lying there and I said to Huang, just drive me back to Hanoi. Just take me back to Hanoi, right? I just need to have a few more days of rest. And the old woman starts saying something. And I'm like, let's just go. And Huang's can't barely speak. And Huang said, she says you're really ill and I need to take you to the hospital. And I said, no, it's fine. Let's just go back. And he said, Johann, this is the only person who survived the Vietnam War from this village. I'm going to listen to her health advice, not yours. We're going to the hospital. So he took me to this hospital where I was the only European they'd ever treated. And I go in and I felt this unbelievably extreme nausea, this violent nausea. And they're jabbing me and they're figuring out all sorts of stuff. And I kept saying to the doctors who didn't speak English through Huang, I kept saying, give me something for the nausea to stop this nausea. And the doctor said to me, you need your nausea. It's a signal. It will tell us what's wrong with you. We need to listen to your nausea. And I remember even at the time thinking, oh, that's quite striking. Anyway, they discovered that what had happened is because I hadn't retained any fluids for 3 days, I was severely dehydrated and my kidneys had stopped working. It was like I had been in the desert. And when I eventually left the hospital, I said to the doctor, what would have happened if Huang had driven me back to Hanoi? And he said, oh, you would have died on the journey. Your kidneys had stopped. You would have died. And I remember thinking, God, that nausea saved my life. I have to listen to that nausea. I thought it was very challenging. And it became really a central part of how I thought about what I had been getting wrong about my own depression and anxiety. I'm happy to talk more about that if you want, Marianne.
Well, of course I do, because you say in the book that you yourself had been experiencing depression and anxiety since you were a teenager. So tell us about what the doctor told you. Tell us about the journey that you took and how you came to understand that on an emotional and psychological and even spiritual level, we need to listen to our nausea as well. What was your own journey with psychotherapeutic drugs?
Well, for me, the reason I wrote this book is, and it's very connected to this thing you're asking about, is that there were these two mysteries that were really hanging over me. And to be honest, I was quite afraid to look into. And I think the first mystery has only become even more important in the last year. So the first mystery was, I'm now 42 years old. Every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased in the United States, in Britain, and across the Western world. And I wanted to understand why, right? Why is this happening to us? Why is it that with each year that passes, more and more of us are finding it harder to get through the day? And I wanted to understand that exactly for the reason you give, for a very personal reason, which is that when I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and explaining that I had this feeling. I remember the way I put it then was that I felt like pain was leaking out of me. I couldn't control it. I didn't understand it. I felt quite ashamed of it. And my doctor, who was a perfectly decent person, told me a story I now realized was really oversimplified. My doctor said, we know why people feel like this. Some people just naturally have something wrong with their brains. They have a chemical imbalance. You're clearly one of them. All we have to do is give you some drugs. You're going to be fine. So I was given an antidepressant called Paxil, a chemical antidepressant. And when I started to take it, I immediately felt better. I got a very significant boost. And then a few months later, the feelings of pain came back quite dramatically. I went back, I was given a higher dose. Again, I felt better for a little while. Again, the feelings of pain came back. And I was really in this cycle where the pain kept coming back. I was given higher and higher doses until for 13 years, I was taking the maximum possible dose that you're allowed to take, at the end of which I was still very depressed. And I wanted to understand, okay, well, what's going on here, right? And that's why I used my training in the social sciences at Cambridge University to travel over 30,000 miles and interview the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety and, crucially, what solves them. And I just learned that so much of what we've been taught about this subject is not right. And there's a much richer, deeper story that we need to tell about understanding these signals, seeing them not as malfunctions, but as signals. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And when we understand this problem very differently, it actually opens up a different set of solutions that should be offered alongside the option of chemical antidepressants.
Well, that deeper story has to do with the deeper dynamics of what it means to be human. We're not just, as you said, we're not just parts of a machine. We're not machines. We're not just external creatures. God knows we're not just economic creatures. And yet the conversation, that deeper story, is one that has been so peripheralized in our society that we are not getting down to the deeper root causes. Now, spirituality is the path of the heart, and the heart is that which connects us. You're pointing to these lost connections as the root cause, and you talk about many of them. You talk about disconnection from meaningful work, from other people, from meaningful values, from childhood traumas, from status and respect, from the natural world, from hopeful and secure future, from the real role of genes, and from brain changes. Now, one of the things I've heard you talk about is that the neoliberal economic interpretation of our civilization and really the entire construct that emerged out of the Industrial Revolution, starting in England at the end of the 1800s, moving into the Scientific Revolution, this whole rationalistic, technocratic notion of what it means to be human, this very mechanistic Newtonian perspective, has so divorced the soul from any sense of belonging. Like, where does the soul go in? And if we are spiritual beings rather than just externalized physical beings, of course, it leaves the soul homeless. So what did you learn? Because I know that what I just said is very much in line with what you say in the book. What's really going on in this world is that the soul feels homeless, because we are. There's a line in the Course in Miracles where it says, deep within you feel like an alien in this world. And that is because you are. This world is not deeply your home. And if you're told that this world is all there is in fact nothing in this world with deep enough roots to satisfy you. What did you find? And what do you think is the answer in terms of, one of the things I love most about your book, Johann, is 2 points that you make. First of all, and I totally agree with you, the psychotherapeutic tradition, as we now know it, is dominated by a conversation that looks to the individual, like it's just your suffering, which really blinds us to the larger issues that, no, this is suffering you share with other people. And that's important because what you share with other people is the societal conditions that so often bring on the suffering. And then, of course, you also, and you just pointed to this, talk about the fact that if you only see it as brain changes, then this absolves us of responsibility for looking at root causes. Where are we as a culture right now? Not only in terms of how we are psychologically looking at the problem, but also in terms of how we're functioning as a society, which in many ways exacerbates the problem. And what do you see as the real hope for us as individuals and as a society?
Yeah, you just went to a lot of really deep points, Marianne. And I think there's a moment when this really fell into place for me, when a lot of these insights really landed, because I was learning this from lots of different, very distinguished scientists. And I was really, to be honest, quite struggling to absorb this and relate it to what I'd been told for so many years. Then I went to interview a South African psychiatrist named Dr. Derek Summerfield. And he told me a story. Dr. Summerfield happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for people in that country. They hadn't ever had them in Cambodia before. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, had never heard of them. So they were like, what are they? And he explained. And they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he was like, well, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy like, I don't know, St. John's wort or ginkgo biloba. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine left over from the war with the United States and got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial leg and he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's really painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb. And I'm guessing it was pretty traumatic to, go back to work in the field where he got blown up. The guy started to cry all day. He refused to get out of bed. He developed what we would call classic depression. This is when the doctor said to Dr. Summerfield, the Cambodian doctor said to Dr. Summerfield, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And Dr. Summerfield said, what was it? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. The most important message of all, his pain made sense. Actually, they only had to speak to the guy for 5 minutes to see why he was so distressed. One of the doctors figured, if we bought this guy a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. He never became depressed again. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that sounds like a joke. I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. She gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively from this individual unscientific anecdote is what the leading medical body in the whole world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. That I think one of the frameworks through which we can think about this is everyone listening, everyone watching knows you have natural physical needs. Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we've built is good at many things. I'm glad to be alive today. But for a long time, we've been getting less and less good at meeting these underlying psychological needs. And then in the last year under COVID, they went just, just fell through the floor, our ability to get those needs met. And I think the core, because you've got to think about what those doctors didn't say. They didn't say, it's all in your head, right? They didn't say to this poor guy, they didn't say, it's your problem to solve this. Let's give you some therapy to figure out why your thought patterns are not right. They realized that his problem was a social problem and had to be solved at a social level. And the scientific evidence around all forms of what we call mental illnesses is very clear. There are three kinds of cause of all of these problems, and they play out to some degree in everyone who experiences them. There are biological causes. These are very real. They can be very real. Your genes can make you more sensitive to these problems. There are real brain changes that happen when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. There are psychological contributions. An obvious example would be childhood trauma. And there are social contributions, things like loneliness and financial insecurity that I'm sure we'll talk about more. This is called the biopsychosocial model. But what we've effectively done, what we've done in our culture, is tell a purely biological story. My doctor, again, a well-meaning person, told me an entirely biological story about my pain and offered me an entirely biological solution. And because that story was so limited, it's not that it had no truth in it, but because that story was so limited, it didn't ultimately get to the core of why I felt that way. And it's not getting to the core of why so many people in our culture feel the way they do. We've got to understand what's causing this crisis, and then we can build much more effective solutions. And I met people who are doing that all over the world.
The lie is not only about the root causes of depression. The lie is about the purpose of our lives. I was talking to a woman the other day who had been a dean at a very prestigious Ivy League university. And she said, I had to quit. I couldn't take it anymore. These were the top students, the kids who theoretically should have the most to look forward to. And all I was doing was marching them time and time again to the counselor where they could get their psychotherapeutic drugs because they felt no sense of purpose and no sense of meaning. And if I get an MA in this or that, will my life begin to have purpose? If I get a PhD in this or that, will my life begin to have purpose? Everybody feeling that they're just grabbing for the golden ring. That lie that there's something out there, there's some prestige, there's some money, there's something that doesn't have anything to do with connecting you to your real purpose on this earth, which is to heal the world with the love in your heart. Not just what you do, but with who you are. And so I think the lie about depression is connected to these deeper lies about who we are, that we are more than just machines, and why we're here, this sense of meaning and this sense of purpose.
That's so important, Marianne. And it's interesting because, again, this is one of the things I found really challenging when I was doing the research for Lost Connections. So I learned that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. And there were 2 that I found really difficult to learn about. And one directly is exactly what you're speaking to. So everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? You look like a picture of glowing health, Marianne, and I've eaten so badly in the last year. So I'm not saying this with any sense of superiority about junk food, but just like junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, a kind of junk values have taken over our diets and made us mentally sick. So for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like crap, right? That's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that is basically what he said. But weirdly, nobody had actually scientifically investigated this until an amazing man I spent a lot of time interviewing named Professor Tim Kasser, who was at Knox College in Illinois. Professor Kasser discovered loads of really important things, but for the purpose of this conversation, I think it's 2 that are really important. Firstly, he discovered the more you think life is about money and status and showing off, the kind of values that are inculcated through advertising and Instagram and everything like them, the more likely you are to be depressed and anxious by a really significant amount. And secondly, as a society, as a culture, we have become much more driven by these junk values all throughout the last 40 years that I've been alive. That we've been trained to look for happiness in all the wrong places. We've been trained to think, more 18-month-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. From the moment we're born, we're immersed in a machinery that is designed to get us to seek happiness through buying things and displaying them to other people. And at some level, it's kind of banal to say no one watching this is going to lie on their deathbed and think about all the shoes they bought and all the likes they got on Instagram, right? You're going to think about moments of love and meaning and connection. But as Professor Kasser put it to me, we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is important about life.
Exactly, like you said. And with social media exacerbating this, all of these images that make you feel in various ways that you're not enough.
No, you're so right. And it was so interesting to me because Professor Kasser's next stage of his research to me was even more important, which was he was looking at, well, what can we do about that, right? What can we do once we understand that this is a major cause of depression and anxiety among people? And there's kind of two prongs. So one is there are big social interventions. So the city of Sao Paulo, I went there to see this, banned all outdoor advertising because it was just making people feel terrible. And people felt much better after they banned outdoor advertising. There was a campaign in London. There was a campaigner, it was before the book came out, so it must have been about 5 years ago. It was a big advertising campaign all over the London subway system. And it was pictures of an impossibly skinny woman and an impossibly buff guy. And it said, "Are you Beachbody ready?" And it was an ad for like some drink of, like whatever called protein. I'm so unhealthy, I don't even know what they were advertising, but whatever it was. And the implication obviously being, if you don't look like this, you're not ready to go to the beach, right?
Or for love.
And the Mayor of London just banned the ads.
And so what happened? Wait, I'm sorry. What did you say? So what?
The Mayor of London just banned the ad.
Good for London.
Said, we're not having this, right? There was a big campaign as well where people were graffitiing over it, and it just said, the graffiti campaign just said, "Advertising shits in your head," which I thought was a very good slogan. So it's partly that, right? Seeing that advertising is this frenemy and just saying, just a lot of this advertising these are public spaces. We are the public. We control what goes there. Just have much stricter advertising. The second thing Professor Kasser did, I think, was even more important and interesting. And it's something I really urge everyone listening and watching to just try. So he worked with this guy who I interviewed called Nathan Dungan. And Nathan is a financial advisor in Minneapolis. He advises people on like how to draw up a family budget, basically. And he got contacted by a school in a middle-class area. It wasn't rich, it wasn't poor. And they said, "Look, we've got a problem. Please come in and help us." And the problem they had was that the kids at their school were getting obsessed with getting the latest iPhone, the latest Nike sneakers, whatever it was. And if their parents couldn't afford it, which a lot of the time they couldn't, these kids were just losing the plot, right, and going crazy. And so they said to Nathan, "Will you come in and explain budgeting to these kids?" So Nathan comes in and he starts teaching about budgeting, and he quickly realizes these kids don't give a damn about budgeting, right? They just want, there's something in them that's just raging for these objects. So he teamed up with Professor Kasser and they did this different experiment that I think should really encourage all of us. It's very simple. They got a group of these teenagers and their parents to come in, and they met once every couple of weeks for several months. And the first time they met, they just said to the parents and the kids, they were sitting together, just make a list of everything you've got to have. And they didn't define what that meant. And of course, everyone initially says, well, you've got to have a home, you've got to have food. But quite quickly, people start listing stuff that you don't have to have, like Nike sneakers, or the parents would list quite expensive consumer goods. And then they said to them, okay, let's imagine you get this thing that you want. You get the Nike sneakers. How will you feel different? And what was fascinating was none of the teenagers gave the apparent reason for the object. So nobody said, oh, I'm a basketball player, and if I get Nike sneakers, I'll be able to jump higher, right? No one said that. They all said things like, well, if I get the sneakers, people will envy me. Or if I get the sneakers, I'll belong to the group. And it doesn't take long to get people to say this out loud. People start going, well, where have I got this idea in my head? And people start to think about advertising. Then the second stage of this group that met, to me, was most fascinating, where they said, okay, now we want you to write about a moment in your life when you have felt a sense of meaning and purpose. And people named different things. For some people, it was playing the guitar. For me, it would be writing. For some people, it was, taking their kids to the beach, whatever it might be. And then they said, okay, how could you build more of your life around pursuing these moments of meaning and purpose and less around, buying crap you don't need and displaying it on Instagram. And what they found was just having a group where people had these conversations and checked in with each other, like a kind of Alcoholics Anonymous for consumerism. They measured their values at the beginning and at the end, and it led to a really significant shift in people's values. Just doing some of this deprogramming work, and we know that the lower amount of consumerist materialistic values they had at the end correlates with lower depression and anxiety. And to me, that was so encouraging. I would really urge everyone to. We don't have spaces in our society and our culture, or very few, where we have these conversations, where we build meaningful values. And this of all times is when we need to.
Well, simply joining with other people in meaningful conversation is a meaningful value. That's really what church is. That's really what synagogue is. That's what mosque is. I mean, that's what, like you said, AA for a larger society, just people getting together. When I was running for office, I had asked some of my close girlfriends if they would join with me once a week for a kind of prayer group and just talking. Someone to talk to me and support me, et cetera. When the campaign was over, they said, we don't want to stop. And this has really been in all of our lives. It's every Sunday, 1:30 East Coast time. Not everybody can come every time. There are about 20 of us. Sometimes there are 4 of us. Sometimes there are 10 of us. And it is so meaningful in my life, and I know meaningful in the lives of all the others as well. We just check in with each other. We're just there for each other. And this is really is spiritual. This is what connectivity is. I want to go back a little bit to something else you said about advertising. Now, and also about that ad in London. The problem you would have is that in the United States, people are not as empowered as they are in some place like England in knowing that, hello, the public spaces belong to us. That's bad for us. Today, you get a lot of pushback if you try to say, take that ad down, because advertising is considered, it's one of the false gods almost. Before 1980, before Ronald Reagan was president, medicines were not allowed, pharmaceuticals were not allowed to be advertised on television. And today, it's one of the main advertising phenomena on television. Yeah. It is part of the assault of advertising is take this antidepressant and it would make you feel better. Ironically, you were talking about Anderson Cooper. During my presidential campaign, he just ambushed me about the issue of my having.
I remember
yes,
this.
He did. And I pointed out to him, first of all, the intellectual dishonesty. He himself said that he was on them. He was hardly the person who should have been having this conversation. But I pointed out to him, of course, that one of the main sponsors of his program, to which he very disingenuously said, well, I don't know who sponsors my program, is, of course, pharmaceutical companies. So that's part of the assault that we get even from advertising because of this $100 billion industry.
It's so interesting, Marianne, because there's something that connects, I think, everything you just said, that to me was so important, and it's one of the heroes of my book, Lost Connections. So there's huge evidence that loneliness, again, this is one of the strange things about this conversation, not the conversation with you, but the conversation about depression, is that we have to say unbelievably obvious things as if they're revelations, right? So here's a really obvious thing. Loneliness causes depression and anxiety. I remember saying that in an NPR interview, and the interviewer said, well, this is a very controversial point. And I remember thinking, this culture has gone mad.
The culture is insane. Right. That's exact. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. And people say, oh, that's just an empty platitude. I said to somebody the other day, you say I'm saying empty platitudes. I would think that we would prefer something someone might call an empty platitude to the sociopathic lies that we're all supposed to defer to as though they are sophisticated thought.
You're so right. You're sorry, because it's a sign of how awry the culture has gone. Mm-hmm. That things that would have been absurdly banal to your grandmother and my grandmother are treated like heresies today,
Thank
right?
you, because it is heresy. It is heresy to a $100 billion industry that thrives on the fact that people have become blind to the most obvious truths.
Well, it was fascinating to me because I spent a load of time interviewing the leading expert in the world about loneliness, an amazing man named Professor John Cacioppo, who'd spent a huge amount, massively honorable person who'd done a huge amount of work proving that loneliness causes depression, right? And I was like, at the same time, like, I really admire you. And did we really need a 30-year scientific study to prove this? Okay, but glad you did it. And he also discovered many other really, really important things. He's a great man. But for me, the most important thing is, okay, what do we do with that insight, right? So loneliness causes depression and anxiety. Loneliness has gone off the scale in the United States, where I spent half the year, and in Britain, right? Off the scale. 41% of Americans agree with the statement, nobody knows me well. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none, right? And that's before COVID. Obviously, and I think in a way, although COVID has been a horrific tragedy, COVID should be able to teach us some of these insights, right? Depression and anxiety massively exploded in the last year. Is it that our brains just mysteriously all started to malfunction in the last year? Of course not.
Right.
We were deprived of our basic psychological needs, one of which is loneliness. I'll come to some of the others, I'm sure, like financial insecurity in a minute. But okay, so once you understand that, and again, I struggle to believe that there's anyone who needs to be told that, but evidently there are. Once you understand that, what do we do about it? And so I spent a lot of time going all over the world, looking at people who are building scientific solutions on these insights. And like I say, one of the heroes of my book is an incredible man named Sam Everington, who's a doctor in East London, a poor part of East London where I lived for many years, though sadly he was never my doctor. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not blanketly opposed to chemical antidepressants. He thinks they give some relief to some people.
Yeah, me too.
But he could see two things. Yeah, and I know you've talked about that at length as well, Marianne, because people are so keen to misrepresent this position.
Thank you.
But Sam was really uncomfortable for two reasons. Firstly, he could see that although chemical antidepressants took the edge off for some people, which is worth doing, and for some people that outweighs the side effects, he could see that often it wasn't solving the problem for them. And secondly, he could see that they were depressed and anxious for really obvious reasons, like they were lonely. So he decided to pioneer a different approach. One day, a woman came to see him named Lisa Cunningham, who I got to know well later. And Lisa had been shut away in her home with crippling depression for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, I'll carry on giving you these drugs if you want, but I'd like you to do something else. I'd like you to come into the doctor's offices twice a week and meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people, not to talk about how bad you feel. You can do that if you want, but that's not the point. I want you to find something meaningful that you can do together. So the first time the group met, Lisa literally vomited because it was just so overwhelming for her to be among these people, after being shut away for so long. But the group starts talking. These are inner city, East London people like me. They didn't know anything about gardening, but there was an area behind the doctor's offices that was just like scrubland. And they were like, we could turn this into a garden. So they started to get books out of the library about gardening. They started to watch loads of tutorials on YouTube. They started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. But they started to do something even more important. They started to form a group. They started to care about each other. If one of them didn't show up, the others would go looking for them and say, hey, are you okay? The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. This approach is called social prescribing. There was small studies of it that are happening all over Europe that have found it's more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. But exactly as you say, Marianne, there's an enormous industry to tell Lisa, you are depressed because there's a chemical imbalance in your brain, and you need to drug yourself. And there is no industry to tell her, you seem to be really lonely, why don't we do some gardening together? Now, I'm not saying this could be a solution for everyone.
Yeah, no corporate profits to be made there. So let's go back a little. I want to talk about the teenagers who, as you said, if they just got together and talked about what they thought they wanted was the Nike shoes in order to be loved, really. That's what people want, is to feel belonging, to feel that they're loved, and to feel that they're lovable and that there's someone for them to love. Just the fact that they would be getting together to discuss those things would itself be ameliorative, not just so that they could discover something, but the very act of getting together. And I find that with my group of girlfriends every Sunday where we just don't know. But if you have something that, what's going on for people today? One day we might be talking to Genevieve about her children. One day we might be talking to a couple of other women about the fact that they've been ill. One day we might talk to somebody else about something with men or love or something like that. Just the act of getting together. So I want to stop for a moment, and just for those who are listening who might not realize how much is available just to talk to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 like-minded friends and say, do y'all want to get together on Zoom once a week and just be there for one another? And what's the amazing things that can happen when we do. In terms of gardening, what you were just saying is also important. They've found that a lot with treating depression among returning veterans, connectivity to the natural world. I know Jim Cameron, the film director Jim Cameron was on. He talks about nature deficit disorder. The world is such an ecosystem. We are tied, our disconnection from the land, our disconnection from reverence. You know, a lot, you talk about connectivity and you talk about purpose, but a lot of this, you know, and you just said, why do we need, you know, why we had to have a study about this. For those of us who come from the spiritual and religious field, there is a little bit of, hello, we've been saying this for thousands of years. It's nice that you little upstarts just came along with your social scientific studies.
You're so right. And you know, as you know, I learned a lot from the scientists that I interviewed all over the world, but there was one group of people who taught me more than anyone else, and they're not scientists. And if it's okay, I'll just tell you their story, because I don't think I could have understood these insights in the way that I did had I not met them. So in the summer of 2011, on a big anonymous housing project in Berlin, a woman named Nuria Cengiz, a Turkish-German woman, climbed out of her wheelchair and she put a sign in her window. And the sign said, I got a notice saying I'm going to be evicted next Thursday, so on Wednesday night, I'm going to kill myself. She lives on the ground floor. And this housing project is called Cotti. And as I say, it's a big housing project in a very poor part of Berlin, where basically only 3 groups of people had lived for a long time. There were recent Muslim immigrants, like this woman Nuria, there were gay men, and there were punk squatters. And as you can imagine, these groups didn't get along, but really no one knew anyone, like a big anonymous place anywhere. But people started to walk past Nuria's window and they saw this sign. And so they knocked on her door. They said, do you need any help? Nuria said, screw you, I don't want any help. I'm going to kill myself. She shut the door. But people who'd never met started talking outside her door. They were like, we've got to do something to help this woman. And they all really resonated with her distress, because rents were rising very rapidly in this neighborhood. And in fact, across Berlin, lots of people were being evicted. They were all worried they might be next. And as they were talking, some of the people had an idea. There's a big thoroughfare that goes through Cotti into the center of Berlin to Mitte. And they were like, you know, why don't we just block the road for a day? We'll have a protest. The media will come. There'll probably be some pressure to let her stay in her home. There might even be some pressure to keep our rents down. So Saturday came and they blocked the road and they protested, and they laid like a barricade across the road. And Nuria was like, oh, I'm going to kill myself. I might as well let them push me in the middle of the street. So they wheel Nuria out. She does these slightly bemused interviews saying how, you know, upset she is. And it gets to the end of the day, and the police say, okay, everyone, you've had your fun, take it down and go home. But of course, the people in Cotti knew that if, you know, that would just be that. And they said, well, hang on a minute. Nuria hasn't been told she gets to stay. In fact, we want a rent freeze for our entire housing project. When we've got those 2 things, then we take this barricade down. But of course they knew the minute they left, the police would just rip it down. So one of my favorite people in Cotti, a woman named Tanya Gartner, she's one of the punk squatters, and she wears these tiny little mini skirts, even in Berlin winter. She's hardcore. She said, okay, everyone, I've got an idea. In her apartment, she had a klaxon, those things that make super loud noises at soccer matches. She went and got it and said, okay, everyone, here's what we're going to do. We're going to drop a timetable to man this barricade 24 hours a day until we get what we want. There's going to be at least 2 of us at any time. If the police come to take it down, let off the klaxon and we'll all come down from our apartments and we'll stop them. So people start signing up to man this barricade. People who had never met and would never have met. And you get these very unlikely pairings. So Nuria, who's a very religious Muslim in a full hijab, was paired with Tanya, who is kind of the opposite kind of person. And if I remember right, they had the Thursday night shift. And the first few nights they sit there, they're like, this is super awkward. We've got nothing to talk about. This is awful. As the nights went on, they started talking. Tanya and Nuria discovered they had something incredibly powerful in common. Nuria had come to Berlin when she was 16 with her 2 babies, almost newborns, and she was sent to earn enough money to send back home for her husband. So she worked every job she could while looking after her babies. And after a year and a half, when she nearly had the money, she got word from home that her husband had died. Sitting there in the cold in Kotti with Tanya, she told her something she'd never told anyone in Germany before. She'd always told people that her husband had died of a heart attack. Actually, she said he died of tuberculosis, which was seen at that time as a kind of shameful disease of poverty. That's when Tanya told Nuria something she almost never talked about. She had come to Kotti when she was even younger, when she was 15 years old. She got thrown out by her middle-class family, and she made her way to Kotti, and she lived in a squat. And very soon after arriving, she got pregnant. Nuria and Tanya discovered that they had both been children with children of their own in this place they didn't really understand. They became incredibly close friends. These pairings were happening all over Kotti. Directly opposite this housing project, there's a gay club called Südblock, run by a man I love named Richard Stein, who is a pretty hardcore gay club. To give you a sense of what it's like, the previous place he owned was called Cafe Ana.
Yeah, and Ziploc was going far enough. Yeah.
And as you can imagine, right, when they'd opened this club about 9 months before the protest began. And as you can imagine, some people, there's a lot of religious Muslims in this neighborhood. Some of them were pissed off. Some of them had smashed the windows. When the protest began, Südblock gave all their furniture to the barricade. And after the protest had been going on for about 6 months, they said, you guys should have all your meetings in our club. We'll give you free food. We'll give you free drinks. And even the very kind of progressive people in Kotti, they were like, look, we're not going to persuade these very religious Muslims to come and have meetings underneath posters for gay sex acts. I don't think I could even mention on the Marianne Williams podcast, right? But it did start to happen. As one of the Turkish German women there, Neriman Tanker, said to me, we all realized we had to take these small steps to understand each other. After the protest had been going on for a full year, they had built, a lot of the people who lived there are construction workers. They had turned the barricade into this lovely building with like doors and rooms and a roof. A guy turned up one day named Tunkai. And Tunkai was in his early 50s, and he'd been living homeless. And it's clear when you meet him, he's got some kind of cognitive difficulties, but he had an incredible energy about him. He's always hugging people. He started helping out. And after he'd been hanging around for a few weeks, the people at Kotti said, we don't want you to be homeless. You should come and live in this thing we've built. We really like you. So Tunkai moved in and became a much loved part of the protest movement. 9 months later, the police came to inspect. They would do this every now and then. And Tunkai doesn't like it when people argue. And he thought the police were arguing. So he went to try to hug one of the police officers. And they thought he was attacking them, so they arrested him. That was when it was discovered. Tunkai had been shut away in a psychiatric hospital for 20 years, often literally in a padded cell. Almost no one came to see him. And he'd escaped one day, been on the streets for a few months, and they took him, and he'd made his way to Kotti. So the police took him back to this psychiatric hospital at the other side of Berlin in Charlottenburg. At which point, the entire Kotti movement turned into a kind of free Tunkai protest, right? They descended on this psychiatric hospital. And I remember these psychiatrists are like, well, what is this? We've got this guy we've had shut away for 20 years who no one cared about. And suddenly we've got these very camp gay men, these women in hijabs and these punks demanding his release. But I remember one of the protesters, Uli Hartmann, said, yeah, but the thing is, you don't love him. He doesn't belong with you. This isn't his home. We love him. We're his home. And I remember thinking then, how many of us, if we were carried away to a psychiatric hospital, would have, dozens and dozens of people saying, no, we love this person and we will look after this person. Many things happened at Kotti. They got Tunkai back. He lives there still. They got a rent freeze for their entire housing project. They then launched a referendum initiative to keep rents down. Not my headphones out again. I'll say that again. They then launched a referendum initiative to keep rents down across Berlin. It got the largest number of written signatures in the history of Germany. There is now a rent freeze for every person in Berlin. But the last time I saw Nuria, the woman who'd started all this, I remember her saying to me, I'm really glad I got to stay in my neighborhood. That's amazing. I gained so much more than that. I was surrounded by these incredible people all along, and I would never have known. And I remember one of the other Turkish German women saying to me, Neriman, saying to me, when I grew up in Turkey, I grew up in a village and I called my whole village home. And then I came to live in the Western world. And I learned that here, what you're meant to call home is just your four walls. And then this whole protest began. And I started to think of this whole place and all these people as my home. And she said she realized in some sense in this culture, we are homeless. You need to feel you belong. The Bosnian writer Alexander Heyman said, home is where people notice when you're not there. By that standard, many of us are homeless. And it was so clear to me in Cotti, the insight that you're getting at, Marianne, which is, think about how distressed these people were. Nuria was about to kill herself. Loads of these people were being drugged for depression and anxiety. Loads of them were being drugged for ADHD and lots of other things. Tunkai was shut away in a padded cell. They did not need, in the main, to be drugged. They needed to be seen. They needed to be valued. They needed to be needed and loved. And that to me was so clear in Cotti.
They were there for each other. There was love between and among them. And they worked together for a higher purpose than their individual good. That's it right there. But I want to mention something that is making a lot of Americans depressed today. When you talked about how she said she was going to kill herself on Wednesday and people gathered to help her, yes, I think in America that would have happened. That would have happened anywhere in the world, that deep human yearning to be there for each other. A lot of Americans would feel today that if they went to do the kind of protesting that you were talking about, we're going to make sure, we're going to stay here every night if we have to, 24/7. We're going to gather here to make sure the rent is put down or the rent is free. Americans today would be scared of being tear gassed. They would be scared of a SWAT team coming after them, which is causing tremendous depression among us to realize that our democracy has gotten that far. A lot of Americans today would hear the story of Tunkai going to hug the policeman. And the policeman thought he was attacking them. Americans today are living with the realization, oh my God, he might have been shot by a policeman if something like that would have happened today. And it has happened with people going through mental distress in their interactions with the police. And also, as romantic and ideal it is, and of course I'm glad it happened in Germany, and it would happen in a movie, that they all said to the people in the psychiatric hospital, give him back to us, we love him, you don't. I think a lot of people are depressed by realizing how little chance we would have in many circumstances to actually get him released just because we say he belongs with us. So there are these accumulated layers of resistance to the natural order reasserting itself. And that's what your story says to me. The natural order reasserted itself. She said she was going to commit suicide. They showed up for her. They realized they were all getting evicted. They protested. If somebody had a cognitive disability, people saw it for what it was. The natural order, the ecosystem, the natural ecosystem, which is predicated on people being there for each other. It was trying to assert itself, but this is what's so deep and problematic, Johanna, and I know that you know it's true. You and I agree on, this dominant illegitimate, what you and I see as an illegitimate psychopharmacological explanation of what depression is. You and I agree on how the entire economic system is based on advertising and doing everything that it takes to make people feel we need something, which only increases the depression, which then is only another profit center for that same system.
No, you're 100% right. There's been people have been poisoned to not recognize their own instincts.
That's right.
That, of course, there's this, in the run up to the 2016 election, I was canvassing in Cleveland to get out the vote to stop Trump with a wonderful group of people from the LA LGBT Center. And we were on this street and we met this woman, I'll never forget her. It was this devastated street. About a third of the houses had been demolished. A third were abandoned and a third still had people living in them, often literally behind barbed wire. And we knocked on this door and there was a woman and we were talking to her, and I would have guessed from looking at her that she was in her 60s. I discovered from talking to her she was actually the same age as me. And we're talking, she was very intelligent. There was no way she was going to vote for Hillary. She was very angry. And she made this verbal slip. So she was talking about what the area used to be like for her parents and grandparents, how when they left school at 16, they got jobs, they lived in a nice house, they were okay. And she meant to say when I was young, but what she actually said is when I was alive.
Wow.
And she didn't notice she'd done it. And I remember thinking, and I see this because, I spend a huge amount of my time I spend half my life in the US, and I've been spending a lot of time in Las Vegas, kind of writing a book about something that's happening in Las Vegas, and which is obviously an epicenter of a different kind of pain. But people's psyches have been poisoned. They've been fed a kind of KFC for the soul. They've been taught that life is about things. They've been taught to seek happiness in places that can never deliver them happiness. And they've been taught to neglect or even to despise the things that would in fact bring them happiness, satisfaction, and meaning. But the good thing for us, and this might sound like an odd thing to say, and I don't want to sound like I'm trivializing the pain, which I have felt and is a dreadful, agonizing pain. The fact that the crisis is so bad, that so many people are depressed, that so many people are addicted, is in one sense positive, because it shows it's very hard to ignore the alarm when it's sounding from every building and every vehicle, right? And Professor Anne Case and Professor Angus Dayton have done great work, really important work on what they call deaths of despair, right? If you look at where the previous book I wrote, Chasing the Scream, was about addiction, because we had a lot of addiction in my family and about how we need to think about addiction differently. And you think about places where so you think about the opioid deaths. So more than 400,000 people have died of opioid deaths since 1999. That's the equivalent of every man, woman, and child in Miami-Dade County dying today, right? And where is this happening? It is overwhelmingly happening in the places where suicide not by opioids is highest, where antidepressant use is highest, where all four indicators of despair and distress are highest. These are deaths of despair. When this goes so deep in the culture, when it is 1 in 3 middle-aged women in the United States is currently taking a chemical antidepressant, and many more are depressed and not taking chemical antidepressants, when the level of the despair is that bad, it's quite hard to carry on going, you know what? The solution is you should have worked a little bit harder and bought that one more thing and shown it off on Instagram so people go, OMG, so jealous, right? The script has broken down. And of course, there's an enormous machinery to keep the script going. And that script has been drilled into us really hard, to the point where when people like you are standing on a political stage explaining there's something really wrong here, you're presented as a lunatic rather than the voice of sanity. But do you see what I mean about the scale of the despair in one sense being our ally, tragic though it is?
Well, I do. And I also understand, as you just pointed out, the links that the system will go to peripheralize the voices that you and I would consider sane. The insane is considered sane, and the sane is considered insane.
But you know that great line Christian
yes,
said, Marianne? It's no sign of good...
to be considered healthy. And
it's no sign of good health to be... Yeah, it's no sign of good health to be well-adjusted to a sick society, right?
Unfortunately, though, and I don't mean to be, bringing up the bad news here, but when you were saying that this...
We're talking about depression.
Well, it's all right. It's kind of like about the bad news. But when you were talking just now about how the script is broken down, yes, but unfortunately, it's been replaced by another one. And the script that people are being given now is take this pill and it will be okay. And nothing could be more of a prescription for a dystopian society than to dull the ache. With physical pain, if you break your leg and you have pain, the pain is functional. The pain is important. It's the way your brain is letting you know you need to reset this bone. And when we have psychic pain, the psychic pain is there for a reason as well. You're being told it's a message, like you were talking about the nausea is a message. Psychic pain is also a message. You need to reset your thinking. You need to reset your sense of self. You need to reset your idea of why you're on this earth. You need to reset your idea of a reverent connection to other people, to the earth, to your ancestors, and to your descendants.
Totally. You're so right. And I think this, to me, is the cruelest thing we've done. We have taught people to think of their psychological pain as a malfunction. Right. It is not a malfunction. Right. It is a signal, right? So what my doctor told me, and I stress my doctor was a really good and well-meaning person, but when my doctor, when I was 17, 18, and I was in such distress, and my doctor never said, is there any reason you might feel like this? Instead told me a story that was not right about me. I wouldn't have been able to talk about it then, but as it happened, I had been horrendously abused as a child. That's why I was quite depressed. To just divert away from these underlying causes cuts people off from finding the most meaningful solutions, which is not to say chemical antidepressants can't give some relief to some people. They can, and I don't think it's a coincidence. And it's why I was so excited by a lot of the things you said in the campaign, Marianne, because how would I put this? It's neither a coincidence nor a conspiracy that you had two things that rose at the same time. You had neoliberalism, this extreme individualism, and this, which leads to a huge transfer of wealth to the rich, right? So on the one hand, you have neoliberalism, which causes a huge amount of pain to ordinary Americans. And at the same time as that pain rises, you have the biomedical explanation for that pain, which says to you, oh, this pain is just a malfunction in your head. And actually, you need to buy this stuff to solve it, right? And you think about, let's relate that to something, again, an insight that your grandmother and my grandmother would have thought so stupidly obvious, they would have thought it was bizarre that we've been wasting our time talking about it. Financial insecurity causes depression and anxiety. There's really strong evidence for this. Again, it's kind of like, did you really need scientific studies to tell you that? But okay, there's a lot of scientific evidence to show you financial insecurity causes depression and anxiety. It's one reason, by the way, why depression and anxiety have gone up in the past year. Absolutely. People are really afraid for their jobs. And it's why people felt better when they got the stimulus checks, right? Which should tell us something about some of the ways forward. We've got to stop pathologizing people's distress. We've got to explain to people your pain makes sense. Right. You feel this way for reasons. Now, when you're in the throes of depression or addiction, it may not feel that way. It may feel like your pain is so ambient and so extreme that you can't get a handle on it. But together, as a society and culture, we can understand why we feel this way. Actually, at some level, we know why we feel this way. This isn't like explaining quantum physics or Noam Chomsky's linguistics or some very complicated scientific point. If we stopped and it's interesting, isn't it? I find this fascinating, Marianne, and I think it's one of the reasons why the reaction to you was so vicious. People are off, when you made these points, people are often most vicious when they're being told a truth they don't want to hear. How would I put it? That if we stopped anyone in the street, any ordinary American, and we said, do you think loneliness makes you more likely to become depressed? Do you think financial insecurity makes you more likely to become depressed? Do you think being sexually abused as a child and not having a chance to deal with it makes you more likely to become depressed? We can go down the list of the 9 causes of right back lost connections. 90% of ordinary Americans would agree to every one of those questions, right? And then we say, what causes depression and anxiety? They'll go, oh, it's a problem in your brain. Yeah, right. So we've been, been, which is not to say there aren't real problems in people's brains, of course. So it's a really good illustration of how we've been taught to mistrust the things we already know and the things that all of our intuitions and our nausea tell us. Absolutely. We have been taught to not know what, in fact, we know. And tens of millions of Americans living with chronic economic tension and anxiety. You know, I was with a group of politicians one day. We've been talking about economic issues, and then they said, well, what do you think we ought to do about the mental health crisis? And I said, stop driving everybody crazy. How about exactly. Try some economic justice? Also, and you know a great illustration of that, Marianne. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in. Because what you're saying is so true and so important. Really interesting illustration of this. In Canada, in the 1970s, they did an experiment. The Canadian government chose a town, seemingly genuinely at random. It was they chose a town called Dauphin, which is in Manitoba. It's about 4 hours out of Winnipeg. And they said to a really large number of people in this town, from now on, we're going to give you a guaranteed basic income. It was the equivalent of about $12,000 US in today's money. So you're not going to live well on that, but you're not going to become homeless, right? It said there's nothing you have to do in return for this money, and there's nothing you can do that means we'll take it away from you unless you go to prison. And they just wanted to see what happened. This was studied by a brilliant social scientist called Dr. Evelyn Forget. Loads of interesting things happened, including, interestingly, nobody gave up work. But the most important outcome for me is there was a massive fall in all mental health problems. In fact, mental health problems that were so severe people had to be shut away in psychiatric hospitals, that fell by 9% in just 3 years, which you won't find any drug that causes a fall of mental health problems of that level.
Absolutely.
Right? And as Dr. Forget put it to me, giving people a secure income is an antidepressant.
Absolutely.
Right? And again, think about how people felt when they got their stimulus. And you talked about this a lot in the campaign, I know.
It's the garden, it's the cow. Well, we have lost a sense of the sacred. Yeah. And when people are made to feel your life is sacred, that also means your sadness is sacred. Your sadness has meaning. And connecting to the world makes meaning. And justice has meaning. You know, in Judaism, love mercy, do justly. Do justly. Justice is important. And when you're talking about economic unfairness, when you're talking a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of 1% of your population, leaving everyone else in greater and greater numbers to experience, if not poverty, that near poverty level, which still means the chronic tension and anxiety all the time, there's a lack of justice there. Where there is lack of mercy, where there's lack of justice, where there's lack of reverence, there is chaos. There is internal and external chaos. And yes, you will be depressed. And yes, you will be anxious. Why don't we start from agreeing on that, and then we can fix it? You know, when you were...
But it's so interesting, Marianne, because I keep thinking about that interview you did with Anderson Cooper, because I think in a sense, how would I put it? We are always, in this debate, people who are setting what, by the way, is in all the psychiatry textbooks. I mean, in theory, they agree with all of this, right? Biopsychosocial model is meant to be their model. Although, of course, they don't do it in practice. Most of them, some do. There's this kind of defensiveness where we're meant to, you know, where we're treated as if we're crazy. And I just want to kind of say to people, okay, let's just go through this bit by bit. Let's go through these 9 causes of depression and anxiety. Do you want to tell me that loneliness doesn't cause depression? Do you want to tell me that financial insecurity doesn't cause anxiety? Do you want to tell me these things haven't increased? When you go by step, they can't really dispute it. What they can do is impute to us positions we don't hold, like, you want to force everyone to stop taking antidepressants. No, obviously we don't. I took them for many years. What they have to do in this debate is create a kind of fictitious straw man and argue against an imaginary Marianne Williamson, right? Rather than engage with what we're saying, because they can't really dispute what we're saying. It's obvious these things cause depression, and it's obvious we should be dealing with them as the first recourse, in my view.
A tangential subject is why, when you say that, do they say, well, he's right, and even celebrate your work? When I say that, she's dangerous and crazy. Maybe it's just that I was running for president. But
I think it's an element of, again, you don't need me to tell you this, but you don't need to mansplain this, but I think there's an element of misogyny in it.
Too.
I think there's also an element, people will hear things from a British man with a posh sounding voice that they won't hear from an American woman. But why do you think that is? That's interesting. Why do you think?
I think that anything that challenges the dominance of any aspect of corporate influence, and big pharmaceuticals are big on top of that. I think the word went out. She's got to go. You know, that's not towing the line.
Yeah.
I want to talk about.
I mean, I think about. So one of the other long-term projects I'm doing, it's actually why I was in Vietnam and why I got that food poisoning. So I'm writing a biography of Noam Chomsky with this corporation.
Wait, you are?
I think
You're writing a biography of Noam Chomsky?
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's very rich.
Yeah. He's an amazing person, and I think about two of the most amazing people in American public life at the moment, Noam Chomsky and Cornel West, who are such very different kinds of people, but such deep truth tellers. And you think about how viciously they've been smeared and ridiculed, because of course, I would almost say the amount you are savaged in the mainstream is one of the measures of how much you might be telling the truth. If you're being lauded by, that part of the mainstream, funded, as you say, by, these corporations, that's when I think you should worry, right? When they're cheering you, that's when something's gone wrong.
I read somewhere that if you want to know who controls you, ask who you're afraid to challenge.
Yeah, Voltaire said that.
Hello.
Exactly. Find out who you're not allowed to criticize, and they're the powerful ones.
And also what you said, the people who are afraid it might be true and whose own personal citadels are being challenged by this. Because if what you're saying
I also understand. Exactly. But I also understand, there's a less disreputable reason why some people get defensive about this. I'm not talking about the people in the public debate. Ordinary people who have been, like, I understand this defensiveness because I felt it. And I write about this a lot in the book. So I was told, the reason you're depressed is there's something wrong with your brain. And there's one thing that can help you, which is these drugs, which did help me for a short while and then caused terrible side effects. 70% of men who take them experience, it affects their sexual functioning. For me, it became really obese, which is another common side effect, particularly a Paxil. And I was really angered by the kind of arguments that we're making now when I first heard them, because I was hearing lots of things that were not being said. But I think the main reason I was angered is because at that time, if you've been told, firstly, if you've got a story for your pain, even if it doesn't work very well, and that story didn't work very well for me, at least you feel like you know where you are. And there's a moment in the dismantling of a story where you feel very disorientated, or you don't feel you understand your own distress. But also in this culture, and I really saw this in that Anderson Cooper interview, what he was trying to activate in people is lots of people have been told, this is your solution, right? This is the solution. And if it sounds like we're saying, which we're not, we're going to come away, we're going to take away your solution. We don't want to take away anyone's. If people want, this should definitely be one of the things on the menu, people. But we're going to take away this and we're going to leave you all alone with your pain. Which of course is not what we're saying, but that's how some people can hear it at first when they don't hear the next sentence and the next sentence and the next sentence. So I think there's defensiveness around this because people are in such pain, and this is the one thing they've been told they'll ever be given to help them with that pain. So I think in a way, my focus is not so much on like yours. My focus is not so much on attacking the drugs, partly because the drugs give some relief to some people, as well as causing bad side effects, as well as not ultimately solving the problem for most of us. But mainly because, in a sense, my argument, and I know your argument as well, is all about let's broaden the menu of options. Let's understand the causes and broaden the menu of options. Let's find out what's the cow for you, right? What's the cow for all of us? When we broaden the menu of options and people know, oh, okay, so drugs gave you a little bit of relief and some side effects and you still felt a bit depressed. How about this free gardening program? How about a universal basic income? How about therapy programs for survivors of abuse? There's a whole range of things. Once they know that it's not this or nothing, and they know that they can carry on if they want to, then I think we can have a less triggered conversation, which is exactly what you've been working to have as well.
I want to move into a couple of things, actually, before I let you go. One has to do with addiction. I think that one of the blind spots regarding antidepressants is that it has come out, even though just as, the opioid crisis occurred because of the intentional lie told by pharmaceutical companies that these opioids were not addictive, even though thousands of years ago, people knew that narcotics were addictive. Well, they tried to claim that these antidepressants are not addictive as well. And in many cases, they still do. It is actually scientifically established now they are addictive. And I've known many people who've been on them for years, don't even remember what the situation was in life that they were first put on them, have a very, very difficult time getting off them. So that's another thing. I think people getting on antidepressants, in too many cases being told, expect to be on this for the rest of your life, not realizing the addictive potential. But I also want to take this moment to tell everybody who is listening right now, and I'm sure that Johann joins with me in this. If anything that we're saying makes you question your antidepressant use, The last thing we're suggesting that you do is just throw them in the trash right now. It is extreme.
Or it'd be a
It is a
catastrophe,
catastrophe. If anything we're saying makes you question this, talk to your doctor. If you decide that maybe this is not for you, you must be weaned off them under the medical supervision very, very carefully. So please, we're shouting that from the rooftop. Anything you want to add to that, Johann, before I go on to the next thing?
You're so right. And I had this, I remember, even though I explained very clearly in the book, as you know, that, well, firstly, my advice is anyone listening who takes chemical antidepressants, for whom the benefits outweigh the side effects, and there are plenty of people like that, they should carry on taking them. If you're going to stop, you must stop very slowly because you can have horrendous withdrawal effects.
Terrible.
And I remember at the time,
or worse.
When the book came out, being someone attacking me, saying, well, here's this person who stopped taking them and had horrendous side effects, so this proves you're wrong. And I thought, well, what?
Try getting off heroin too. That doesn't mean it was wrong to get off heroin. Yeah,
it's an extraordinary. These drugs are given so casually. Yeah. I think we should all have agreement that there's a lot of work in Britain at the moment. A lot of doctors who've been working on. In fact, there's just been, I don't want to get the details wrong. I'll tweet about it after the show comes out so I get the details right. But there's just been measures among medical bodies in Britain that there has to be much more warning to people when they start being given these drugs, that it can be very hard to stop. There can be very severe withdrawal effect. For me, the primary tragedy of the specific thing you're describing is not that they carry on taking the drugs. Some people get help from it. Some people get side effects. That's to be weighed individual by individual. For me, the tragedy is you don't then give the person the chance to understand why they felt that way and to learn the lesson of the nausea. I think a lot about Dr. Vincent Felitti, who I interviewed, who's done amazing work showing, again, your grandmother and my grandmother would not have found this surprising, but survivors of childhood abuse are significantly more likely to become depressed and anxious. But he also discovered something even more important, which is that, so they had identified, they did a study in San Diego, they asked people to identify on a form whether they'd experienced abuse as a child. And then the next time they came back, just whenever they came back, they weren't called back, but the next time they came in with a problem, their doctor was told to say to them something like, I see that when you were a child, you were abused. I'm really sorry that happened. That should never have happened. You should have been protected. Would you like to talk about it? And 40% of them didn't want to talk about it, but 60% of people did. And they wanted to talk about it on average for 5 minutes. What was fascinating was just 5 minutes of an authority figure saying, this should never have happened. You should have been protected, led to a significant fall in depression and anxiety. And this fits with a wider body of scientific evidence. People like Professor Steve Coles at UCLA, who you should meet, Marianne, you'd love him, and Professor James Pennebaker at Florida State University. It's not actually the trauma that destroys you. It's the shame about the trauma. And once you're given a place, a safe way to release that shame and to change how you think about yourself, to not carry that in your body and your spirit, your depression significantly reduces. And for me, what's so frustrating when I think about my own story, again, I don't blame my doctor. I don't think I would have been able to talk about it when I was 17, 18. But because I had this very fixed story, there's just something wrong with my brain, which also has an effect on your sense of self. You think you're broken, right? I never explored until I was much older what had happened to me when I was a child. I didn't think it through. I didn't deal with the pain and I didn't release the shame I felt around that. That could have happened much sooner. I could have been freed from that depression and anxiety much sooner. And that's just one example of a cause. There are many causes like that people are being cut off from because we're being told overly simplistic stories. We need to tell much more complex, much more common sense, much more soulful stories about why we're depressed and anxious and help people to understand the pain they're feeling, not pathologize it, not dismiss it, not try to kind of drug it into submission.
Well, people want to feel that their pain is validated. Just somebody saying, I'm sorry that happened to you.
Yeah.
A young man reached out to me recently. He said, my mother hanged herself 4 days ago, and I'm wondering if you might help me. I'm having a problem with focus and clarity.
Wow. Wow.
He had no sense that your mother hanged herself. Focus and clarity will not be with you for a while. We have lost the legitimization of grief. Grief is functional. It's an aspect of the deep sadness that we have made wrong when in fact it's right. I used to say to people when I used to do these grief support groups, this is a grief support group, not a grief denial group. Grief is important.
You're so
Grief
right.
is how we integrate an experience that otherwise would overwhelm us and we wouldn't be able to take in. And so, when someone says to me, well, if I didn't, what do you want me to do? If I didn't take this pill, I'd just sit here and cry for 35 days. What would you have me do? My answer is, cry for 35 days. If you have 35 tears
You're
to
so
cry,
right.
crying 17 tears is not enough. And if anything is sacred, your sadness is sacred. Rilke said, let me not squander the hour of my pain. Anguish has meaning. It's that listening to the nausea. And the time to be heartbroken is when your heart is breaking. And when you've lost someone that you love, your heart is broken. What kind of person isn't in grief when their mother dies or their father dies or their loved one dies or their child dies? This doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It's how nature will absorb the experience. Even an elephant, when an elephant, the baby dies, I think the elephant stands there, for 2 days before moving on to join the rest of the elephants. Anyway, go on.
You're so right. There's a woman I interviewed a lot for the book called Dr. Johann Hari, who is at Arizona State University. He's a remarkable person. Joanne's daughter Cheyenne died, and Joanne noticed. So Joanne was very quickly offered drugs for the fact that her child had died, and she then started to research this and discovered that, I forget the figure now, but some extraordinarily high proportion of people whose babies die in the United States are immediately drugged. So she starts to work with these parents. But she had one mother she worked with who her child had died. And at night, she heard her child's voice speaking to her, not in a frightening way. And that woman was diagnosed with psychosis and given antipsychotic drugs. And Joanne did lots of interesting research. And one of the things she showed, I think this is really interesting and really connects to a lot of the things we've talked about, is that grief and depression have the same symptoms. And in some ways, I think what depression is grief for your own needs not being met.
Absolutely.
For your own life not being how it should. And Joanne did this research as well. I'm trying to remember it because it's a while since I wrote the book. She did this research. So it's such a revealing thing, this. So until the 70s, I think it was the 70s, early 70s, the American Psychiatric Association didn't have a formalized diagnosis of depression. So they invented one for what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's like the list of diseases, basically. So they drew up a list of criteria for how psychiatrists should diagnose depression, and it was obvious things like crying a lot, feeling you can't go on, and they send this out to psychiatrists all over the United States. But psychiatrists come back and they go, "Oh, we've got a bit of a problem."
That's everybody.
Because what they said, if we use these criteria,
I know. I've seen one of those questionnaires. It's like, who's not?
Well, they said if we actually, because they said if we use this criteria, we would have to diagnose every grieving person as depressed. And so the APA get together and they say, well, that's not what we meant. So they invented something they called the grief exception, where they said, okay, if you're crying a lot, if you feel life isn't worth living, you're diagnosed the person is mentally ill, unless someone they love has died in the last 6 months, in which case they're not crazy, they're not mentally ill, it's just a normal reaction. But that begged the question, well, okay, why is losing someone you love mean that you're not crazy for feeling this way, but not if you're made homeless? Why not if you lose your job? Why not if you're stuck in a job you hate for the next 40 years? There's all sorts of things we can imagine. So what the APA did is they gradually, and also under pressure from the insurance companies, they gradually reduced the amount of time you're allowed to feel sad when someone dies. It was initially, I think, 6 months. In the end, they cut it down to 2 weeks. And the last one, they just got rid of it entirely. So you can see again how crazy these ostensibly scientific notions are, partly how driven by capitalism and capitalist values they are, but also how crazy they are, right? Like exactly what you say. Grief is not a matter, this is what Joanne always says. grief is not a malfunction.
Yeah, your mother died
Grief is a form of love.
Your mother died 2 months ago. Aren't you over it yet? Right.
But you know this kid who emailed you? When you said that, Marianne, it made me think about, this is one of the hardest conversations I had about the book. I won't say where because I don't want to identify the person. Just because they asked me a question and I think it was filmed. So I gave a speech where I talked about a lot of the things we're talking about. And a young woman stood up, very young woman, I think she was 16, stood up and she was almost crying. And she said, well, what you're saying isn't right. Because my psychiatrist has told me I've got, and then she gave this list of about 10 disorders in inverted commas. She said, I've got ADHD, borderline personality disorder. I forget what, it's a huge long list, right? Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to challenge her. And I said, could we talk afterwards? So I met up with her after I'd done the signing and I went and sat with her and we ended up talking for 2 or 3 hours. It emerged that this young woman, this is so awful. This young woman is one of the most dreadful stories I've ever heard. This young woman was sexually abused when she was very young by several members of her family. And she harmed herself as part of how she was made to feel by this abuse. And I listened to her describe this abuse, which is truly, I've talked to a lot of people who've been abused. This is one of the most dreadful things I've ever heard. And I said to her, I don't think you've got any disorders. I think the people who did this to you have something wrong with them, and you should be unbelievably proud that you survived and that you are the sane, impressive, articulate person I see before me. And just to me, it was such an illustration, and this is not an uncommon thing. The idea that someone who is supposed to be a trained professional would sit with this person.
I could not agree with you more.
And not listen to their, I mean, it's sickens, do you know what I mean, Marianne? It sickens me.
I've been through it so much, which is why I wrote my book. And I'm sure exactly it's why you wrote yours. Yeah. When people say I have an anxiety disorder, I say, who do you think is not anxious right now? Look at the state of the world. If you're not, I've been saying for years, if you're looking at what's going on in the world today and you're not depressed, something is wrong with you.
Exactly. And I really want to say it's really interesting because I think one of the points that we can make and should make. So I remember the night before Lost Connections came out, I was sitting with a friend of mine and I just said, she said, what do you think the reaction to the book's going to be? And I said, I'm really proud of this. I've done a lot of research, but I think people are going to go, isn't this kind of obvious? I mean, I think there's lots of detail in it. People won't know, lots of stories people won't know, but isn't it kind of obvious? And then the book came out and I kept being introduced to saying, now we're going to talk to Johann Hari, who's written this incredibly controversial new book. Like I mentioned, the NPR person who told me it was controversial to say loneliness causes depression. And I remember just thinking, this is really odd. It's a sign that the arguments we're putting forward are needed, but I find this so strange that our minds have been poisoned so deeply by all sorts of things that we can't see things. A culture that would look at that girl and give her a shopping list of disorders that she was suffering from, it's actually it's actually deepening the work of the abuser.
Right, and making her feel very disempowered, like there's something wrong with her. She's damaged. Yeah. You're damaged. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, by the way, what of course, all abusers say to their victim, you made me do it. I'm doing it because there's something wrong with you, right? So to then have a system that when they go for help, because someone goes, well, imagine saying to a child that you've got borderline personality disorder. So telling her her personality is disordered, that really is sickening. And I think it's interesting though, because I think one thing that we can, it's important for people who are sympathetic to us to stress, is I think COVID has really helped open people's minds to these arguments. Of course, COVID is a horrific tragedy, don't misunderstand me, but everyone can see depression and anxiety and addiction, by the way, have gone up in COVID, right? And everyone can see that's not because of some biological cause.
That's right.
I mean, you could say the virus is a biological cause that changed society, but it's not because of, it's not that we all spontaneously malfunctioned, right? Our culture has changed. The way we live has changed dramatically in the past year. Of necessity, we had to suppress the virus, or we should have done much more. It's another debate, I know. But the way we live changed, and we all felt a lot worse, right? And there was a lot more depression and anxiety. that should get us to think, well, what was changing before the virus came along? Was that also affecting depression and anxiety? And the evidence is very clear that it is. And by the way, the position we're putting forward, this isn't some like wacky fringe position. The World Health Organization, the leading medical body in the world, has explained the primary drivers of depression and anxiety are social, and the solution should be primarily social. So these are not fringe. It's interesting. The people who are how to put it, the scientists who are dispassionately paid to pay attention to the evidence actually make exactly the points we're making, right? It's more when you get into this corrupted mode, which is partly influenced by all the corporate interests that you're talking about, and partly influenced by a kind of wider cultural phenomenon of, if you live in a culture dominated by junk values and you're in pain, you've been trained to think, well, what do I buy now that will make me feel better, right? We've been trained to approach the whole world through the prism of consumerism. So of course, in a culture, a deeply lonely, individualistic culture like that, it's going to appear to be a kind of natural impulse to go, well, what do I buy? What do I swallow? What do I take that will make this go? And I don't say with insecurity, I felt that way for many years. But we've got, that the truth is, it just doesn't work. It gives some people some relief for some time. For some people, that's absolutely worth doing. But it doesn't ultimately, the best long-term research into chemical antidepressants is called the STAR-D trial. And it showed most people taking them do become depressed again. Stress again, that doesn't mean
of course.
No one was helped. Some people are helped. I was helped for a while, but we've got to have a more truthful conversation. And actually, the insights about chemical antidepressants, to me, are pretty banal. Some people get a bit of relief. Some people get bad side effects. In the long term, most of them become depressed again. Those are three scientific facts. They're pretty banal.
And of course, the myth that people are told is, well, you just take these, it'll take the edge off while you're doing the deeper work. But no, it means too often that you will not do the deeper work, because the deeper work comes from facing the pain. If you take an anti-nausea pill, you can't get the message of the nausea. Like you had said, just give me an anti-nausea. The doctor said, if he'd given you an anti-nausea, you probably would have died, that it was the nausea that carried the message.
Well, you've gone to the deeper point, which is, let's imagine, and I don't talk about this often, but I think it's important to think about. Let's imagine that tomorrow a chemical antidepressant was invented that genuinely did take away depression and anxiety, right? That meant you could be really lonely, you could be terribly financially insecure, you could be humiliated at work and you wouldn't feel any pain about it. I don't think that would be desirable.
That's the worst dystopia possible. That's not what we want. That means you've been completely disconnected from your suffering. And one of the dangers of being disconnected from your own suffering is that it fosters desensitization to the suffering of others. When the United States invaded Iraq, one of the most horrible aspects of that to me was what was happening inside the American people, that we somehow were not registering that invasion meant we were dropping all of those bombs, all of that fire onto the homes of men, women, and children, defenseless against this, whose country had had nothing to do with 9/11, who had done nothing to us, and any intelligent observer could see we really didn't have proof that they had these weapons of mass destruction, not to even mention the fact that we do business with countries that have weapons of mass destruction every single day. What? Well,
and the US has weapons of mass destruction.
Right, thank you. So what disconnection from our own pain led to that? Being disconnected from your pain makes it more likely you will be disconnected from the pain of others. You keep that pain on the other side of the world. You keep that pain on the other side of the city. And that's how the system operates. Whatever suffering.
Well, you know that great line, you know that line James Baldwin said, and I think I think about this all the time at the moment. The reason they're so angry is because if they weren't angry, they'd have to feel their pain.
Yeah.
You know, it's so much of there's lots and lots of things going on, and I don't want to offer a simplistic solution, a simplistic explanation for everything, because that would be wrong. But so much of the crisis that we're seeing in our culture at the moment, it's not by any means the only one, but is that if you create a culture that doesn't meet people's deepest needs as human beings, that will come out in all sorts of... Think about that woman I met in Cleveland. I could understand, although I begged her not to vote for President Trump, I could understand
he was speaking,
why in her situation...
He was speaking to her feelings of displacement, the same way that Bernie Sanders did. I mean, they were the two candidates in 2016 who legitimized people's feelings that they've been screwed by the system. And that rage of despair was going to be expressed. So there was the authoritarian populist who was Trump. Then there was the progressive populist who was Bernie. But a woman who was saying is that wrong? Let's continue with what we've been doing. Too many millions of people felt, "What are you talking about, lady? I'm drowning here." And they felt that their pain was not validated. And I'm not saying that I don't think Hillary Clinton cared about their pain, but her campaign did not validate people's pain. And I think people want...
Well, that woman in Cleveland.
And by validating the rage, that when Trump validated people's rage, he was validating their pain. And I think that's absolutely a factor in his winning in 2016.
Oh, 100%. I mean, that woman in Cleveland said to me, she was quite well... she'd absorbed a lot of information. She said, it was not long after Hillary Clinton had said... He says, "Make America great again."
We're already great.
I say America's already great. And she said, "Ain't great for me. Look at my street." And I think there's a thing about, and I do think the Democrats have, partly thanks to your work and Bernie and so many other people, really have absorbed this message. If your response to authoritarian right-wing populism and all the toxicity and vileness and evil it brings is to say, we're the ones saying, what are you complaining about? Like, things are great. And I know Hillary had a more complicated message than that. And I'm grateful to her for endorsing my book. And, I don't want to sound like she's saying that, because she's not. But that is how she was heard by some people. And that was a failing on the part of some people in her campaign. And I think we've got to deal with the deep social crisis in the society and the culture, or we're going to keep seeing lots of toxic manifestations like this. Depression, anxiety, addiction, political extremism. You've got to have a society that ultimately meets people's needs. If the society becomes so misaligned from people's underlying needs...
The problem we have, of course, is that within politics, within the media, within some of the biggest platforms that we have for public conversation, there is the biggest resistance to having the deeper, most authentic conversation. You, my friend, my new friend, Johann Hari, Lost Connections, remind me of the line from Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, "A writer is a government in exile." And that's what I feel writers have an opportunity to do. When establishment forces don't want to say it, we will. Whereas your book, Lost Connections, talks about all the very profound things you were talking about. In my book, Tears to Triumph, I also talk about what Jesus has to say about it, what the story of Moses has to say about it, what Buddha has to say about it, all of which have more contemporary relevance than some people seem to think. I think you are brilliant. And I know that I say this on behalf of so many people who have heard this. Have heard this podcast. I know I express a deep gratitude, not just from me, but for all. Obviously, your readers are very grateful to you, but I know the people who've been listening are very grateful to you. I hope that this is the beginning.
Well, I'm so grateful to you, Marianne.
Well, thank you.
The work you've done is, I was really struck by the work you did during the campaign to inject into the conversation the need to talk about the sickness of the culture and the society and the tremendous hope we can have about how to fix that. And I think you reached a huge audience doing that, because there's an incredible because people know it's true. People know it's true. You won't, and people know it's true across the political spectrum. And I think, I think what you're doing is so important, and I'd love to continue the conversation. And I'm thrilled to talk to you, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Me too. I have felt that way this entire time we've been talking. I hope this is just the beginning. I think the world of you, Johann Hari. I bless you. I thank you, and I wish you all good things As I told you earlier, my daughter lives in
Oh.
London. I hope that someday we'll have a chance to meet and talk in person.
I would love that. We'll go for a pint. And if you want to know where to get the book or the audio book, go to www.thelostconnections.com, or my book about addiction is www.chasingthescream.com, and you can see where to follow me on social media.
And
all
we
that
also
stuff
have it written
there
down.
as well.
So it's thelostconnections.com and chasingthescream.com. I can't imagine anybody not going there right now. Thank you so much, Johann Hari. All my best to you. God bless you, honey.
Mwah. Thanks, Marianne.
So that was the incredible Johann Hari talking about his book, Lost Connections. Every word he said was so impactful for me, and I'm sure that it was for you too. And for those of you who felt a lot of personal relevance in this conversation, know that my heart goes out to you, and I'm feeling you. And I hope that his book, I hope my books, I hope they're both very helpful to you. Okay, now I got some really good questions. The one I'm going to take is from someone named Z. And Z says, how do we remember who we really are, our deepest feelings, etc., while trying to survive in a full-time job that demands you switch off those parts of yourself? Well, I think that is a very relevant question for a lot of people today. Just to stay afloat economically, we're in this work mode that we have to be in. So many people feel such stress, so many responsibilities that we have on top of us, with our families, with our work, with our jobs, with our various activities, even in the midst of COVID. So this is what I want to say to you, Z. In order to find inner peace, in order to feel happiness, in order to feel the level of calm that we're all looking for, this involves lifestyle decisions. If you wake up in the morning, why do you take a shower? Why do you take a bath? Because you want to wash yesterday's dirt off your body. You don't want to go into the day with yesterday's dirt. If you don't meditate in the morning, if you don't pray in the morning. I was reading Jack Canfield, actually, somewhere on social media the other day. I said that Jack Canfield said, 20. He says, this is what I do for an hour every morning when I wake up. 20 minutes of exercise, 20 minutes of reading, and 20 minutes of meditation. If you wake up in the morning and the first thing you do is you go to the news of the world, you go to your phone, you go to the computer, you go to the television, radio, whatever, and you download the consciousness of the world that, as Johann and I have just been talking about, has gone mad. There's no way to then find real happiness. There's no way to find a place for your own soul within that. So mornings are very important. In any religious or spiritual tradition that I've ever read about, there's an emphasis on the mornings. So when you say you have a full-time job that mitigates against you're going into those deeper regions of authenticity, you've got to carve out the space for your reconnection time. You can see this in religious or spiritual terms. You can see it in secular terms. It can be a reconnection with nature. It can be spiritual practice. It can be meditation. But you have to make intentional, proactive moves today, because so much of the way we are living in our modern society mitigates against happiness. Mitigates against happiness because it mitigates against this authenticity, going deep, looking at your pain, looking at what's real, looking at what's true. So when you say, what if you're in a full-time job that demands you switch off those parts of yourself? You need to demand that you won't. I will not let this world do that to me. And I know it can be hard. I'm not denying that it can be hard. But if it means you wake up 30 minutes earlier in the morning, wake up 30 minutes earlier. I know there was a time in my life that I realized there was a lot of stupid things I was spending time on. And I thought, I cannot continue to do those things so much and have the life I want. Just ways that I was wasting time, reading things that were stupid, looking at things on TV that were stupid. Or just, I wasn't, it's like when Johann was talking today about junk food, junk values. We have a lot of junk thoughts. There are too many things that we allow to impinge upon the sanctity of our own minds. And it's not just, if we're honest with ourselves, it's not just the job. And the other thing I'd like to say about that, Z, is your job is your ministry too. Where can you align your sense of ministry with your job? Because if you are in contact with any other human beings, you do have a chance to experience the sacred at work. You do. I mean, any time that you are interacting with other human beings, or if there's a product that you are producing that is helping to produce, that is any way going to make anybody's life better, include within the circle of that which is sacred, that which you do for work. There's more there than you might think. I was a cocktail waitress when I first started doing the Course in Miracles. And I was like so amazed. I would walk around saying, wow, like within the world, I'm the waitress and they're here at a bar. But something deeper is going on here. We're all amazing souls. Something I was going to say during my conversation with Johann that I forgot to say was, I have often said to audiences when I've been speaking, I've said, imagine the most painful experience you ever had. And then consider this. It is statistically reasonable to assume that the person to your right has suffered that much as well. It is reasonable to assume that the person to your left has suffered that much as well. It's statistically reasonable to assume that the person in front of you has suffered that much as well, and the person behind you. If we really, within any situation, deepen our realization to what's really going on here, which is other human beings here are going through exactly what I'm going through and want to love and be loved every bit as much as I do, and have deep, authentic dynamics of human suffering just as I do, and want to feel less lonely in this world just as I do, then that changes everything, no matter where you are. Okay? Thank you so much. I appreciate that you were with me today. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Check us out on YouTube. I want to say a special thanks to Lauren Selsky, Amanda Elliott, Austin Kendrick, and everyone at Cast Media. And I want to thank those of you who listened and share the podcast with others. Our goal has always been to have conversations that matter. And all of our guests have brought forth conversations that matter, but I don't think anyone can doubt, boy, Johann Hari really brought it home today. All my love to you, all my best. Have a wonderful week. Thanks.